Going to start out with a question today, pop quiz. But it's easy. You can answer this one. All of you can. How many of you know how to ride a bicycle? How many of you ever learned to do that? Yeah. Okay. Good. So by and large, we understand what needs to happen to successfully travel on a bicycle. We got that because we learned how to do that, right? So tell me, based on your experience of an understanding of bicycle riding, what happens if you're on your bike and you lean too far to the left? What happens? You did this as a youngster when you were first learning. You fall over, right? So you get back on your bike, and you get on there and you're pedaling away. What happens if you lean too far to the right? Same thing. You fall over. And for those of us who have done that, it's not much fun. Pick up a little bit of road rash. If you live out on the gravel like I did, when I was learning how to ride a bike, there's pretty rough terrain out there. When you fall down, it hurts. So you learn to balance. Because biking is a lot better. It's a lot more fruitful. It's a lot more enjoyable when you have balance. Right? So we've covered basic bike riding. Bike riding 101. But what does that have to do with us here today? When very few of us are going to do any real bike riding right now. It's whatever, 9, 10 below, wind chill, minus 31. We're not going to be riding our bikes today. So what does that have to do with us? Bear with me. I'll get there. We will. Today, we've continued our journey through that 12th chapter of Paul's letter to the Corinthians. You know, last week we looked at Paul's assertion that God gives gifts to all people. Everybody gets a gift, and that's really cool. And this week, we've just looked at Paul's assertion that all of the gifts that God gives to all people have value. That all of these gifts are needed. And that no one gift is more valuable or less valuable than are the others. Cool. That's also nice to know. But we need to stop for just a moment and talk for just a little bit about why Paul wrote that. Why did he write that? He was writing to a church that actually had written letters to him saying, we got issues. But it was a church that was divided. It was a divided church in so many ways. They had issues with the rich people opposed to the poor people, which Paul addressed earlier on in his letter. And in this chapter, this 12th chapter that we've worked on for now these 2 weeks, Paul is addressing another division. You see, there was a group of people within that Corinthian church who were utterly convinced that those who spoke in tongues were really a class above the rest of everybody else. You see, in the Corinthians' understanding, as well as in this modern day, speaking in tongues in this usage was basically to utter sounds that weren't readily understandable by everybody else as a language. In other words, they were basically speaking in a divinely inspired language that may or may not have been understandable to the rest of the congregation. But there was a group within the Corinthian church who felt that this ability to speak in tongues was the primary mark of true believers. And this group felt that if you couldn't speak in tongues, well, then you really weren't a believer, but some sort of lesser being. Shouldn't be allowed to have as much of a voice in what the church was doing, how they did church. And that was a problem. You see, Paul saw that this particular group's position of doing church in just only one way, and then holding everything else in lesser priority and even denigrating those things was a real problem. So Paul, and he addresses this in this whole 12th chapter, goes to considerable lengths, writes some 616 words, that's in the English translation, to tell a group of people that their way was not the only way. And now we look back with all of our 21st century wisdom at what was going on in that Corinthian church, and we marvel at how silly some of these folks in Corinth were. I mean, after all, how silly, how short-sighted can it be to think that your way is the only way? How silly is that? Really? And it's easy for us to think that way. Right up to the point when we stop to consider what is going on in this modern society of which we are part. Because it's an increasingly polarized society. Even a perfunctory glance at what is happening today will tell you that we live in a time when people are increasingly less tolerant of views that are different from their own. Don't have to look very far at all to see that. Just look at our government. It's all but paralyzed by partisan politics, where both sides are more concerned with defending their position than they are in making some sort of a compromise so that everybody can move forward. The Democrats maintain that the Democratic Party's position is the only way, while the Republicans maintain that the Republican position is the only way. And names are called, insults are traded, speeches are made that vilify the opposition as though they were lesser beings. And little progress is made while the problems continue to increase. And it's not just in our government. Even here within our United Methodist Church, there are differences of opinion that threaten to bring about a separation within this denomination. There is. It's ongoing. Talked about that in your newsletter. You can see that information there. Because even within our church, and others besides, we who claim the name Christian have divided into different camps, each of whom seem to be more inclined to talk at the other side than to listen to the other side, to hear how they feel. And that's sad. It really is. And this is where modern technology kind of rears up and bites us, because modern technology hasn't helped us all that much. The increased use of the internet has made it possible for people to readily share their opinion while arguing vehemently with any who think differently. Polite, respectful conversations wherein people truly seek to hear and understand what others are saying or feeling have been replaced by stubborn arguments in which both sides seek to utter a crushing rebuttal to what the other side says. And our society is split into opposing camps. Liberal versus conservative, rich versus poor, white versus people of color, America versus the rest of the world, and so on. The list is all but endless. And yet, with all of our prized notions of 21st century knowledge, we've managed to forget something important, something that Paul notes in that passage from the Corinthians that we read just a few moments ago. And he does it very well. He uses the analogy of the human body to prove his point. And he likes this analogy. He uses it also in Romans and Ephesians, just not as in-depth as here. And he says Christ is just like a human body. A body is a unit and has many parts, and all of the parts of the body are one body, even though there are many. Okay? And although Paul was referring to the body of Christ, the church, this analogy, it holds true for our modern society. Because our modern society is inescapably made up of many different parts. There are different political views, there are different religious views, there are different ethnic backgrounds, different genders, different sexual orientations. We are all different, you and I. And yet, we are all part of something so much greater, which is our modern society. And having made that observation about the whole being made up of different parts, Paul goes on to tell the Corinthians, and he goes on to tell us here something that we need to hear again. If the foot says, I'm not a part of the body because I'm not a hand, does that mean it's not a part of the body? And if an ear says, I'm not a part of the body because I'm not an eye, does that mean it's not a part of the body? If the whole body were an eye, what would happen to the hearing? And if the whole body were an ear, what would happen to the sense of smell? But as it is, God has placed each one of the parts in the body just like He wanted. If all were one and the same part, what would happen to the body? What would happen to the body? Because just as a human body is able to function at its best when all of its parts are present and working in their various and different functions, so also does the church, so also does our modern society function at its best when all of its parts, liberals, conservatives, males, females, people of different ethnic backgrounds, and so on, when all of those different parts get to take their different parts to provide a balance in what our modern society is doing. Because too much of one and not enough of the other is not good. It's not. We need to have all of the parts working together to provide a balance so that society can move forward. Kind of like riding a bike. So it is with our society. If it leans too far one way or the other, it doesn't work well. You have to have a balance. So Paul's words that were written almost 2,000 years ago are still words that we need to hear today. He said, God has put the body together, given greater honor to the part with less honor so that there won't be division in the body, and so that the parts might have mutual concern for each other. If one part suffers, all the parts suffer with it. We need to hear those words again. Because God has placed this world and all who live in it into being. We are all from God, and God's intention is that all of humankind should honor and care for each other. And we really need to hear this part again, because it's true. Paul has got this absolutely right. If one part suffers, all the parts suffer with it. Our modern society suffers. Our modern society, our very lives become less than what God intended them to be whenever we hurt others or stand by silently while they are being hurt. Remember what Scripture tells us. Remember what we've talked about here today. Whenever you encounter someone who happens to have an opinion that is different from yours. Other people, believe it or not, this is true. Other people have just as much a right to have their opinion as you do to have yours. And positions other than your own are needed to help provide the balance that our society needs to function at its best. So I encourage you, when you encounter those opinions that are different from your own, listen to hear. Listen to understand where they're coming from, rather than sit there and plot your crushing rebuttal. Because if one part suffers, all the parts suffer with it. So let us seek to understand, let us seek to work together to provide a balance so that all of us may prosper. Amen. Will you pray?